This lecture is on X-ray protection and radiographic health, and it will be a two-part recording. So with X-ray protection, basically the definition is that we're trying to eliminate anything that adds unnecessary exposure to radiation, and some examples would be use of outdated equipment, damaged or malfunctioning equipment, not using protective shielding and not using the lead apron, or even improper use of the equipment by the operator. So things like that are all potential sources of that unnecessary exposure, and that's what we're trying to protect not only the patients but ourselves from. The dentist is responsible for eliminating sources of excess radiation, any structural changes to operatories, and replacing outdated equipment. So just because an operatory may be an operatory you work in, that doesn't mean it's actually yours. And what that also means is that you're not responsible for replacing that equipment if it breaks. Now, they may, charge for repairs if you consistently break things because you're, not being careful or responsible with the use of the equipment, but it wouldn't be, your responsibility to pay for any structural changes that need to be made if they wanted to add an X-ray room. State regulates the health. That's why you have state health departments. You'll also see county health departments, but those are just kind of a breakdown from the state regulatory agencies. I'm not going to ask you about the 10th Amendment, but the 10th Amendment of the Constitution gives the states authority over health issues. States can pass laws and designate radiation safety measures. Some counties and cities also pass ordinances that go above and beyond the state's guidelines, but the states are considered a minimum operating standard only, and counties can add additional ordinances to that, but they can't do anything that would reduce the amount of regulation. So if the state says that your equipment has to be inspected every 2 years, well, a county can't come in and say, well, it only has to be inspected every 5. They can't diminish the state's rule, but they could add to it. They could say that it had to be done once a year. And so they can make tighter restrictions, but they can't make broader restrictions. Okay, I'm not going to ask you on the exam any of these dates. I'm just kind of giving you a timeline. In 1968, the Radiation Control for Health and Safety Act passed, and that set standards for the performance of the X-ray equipment. Before, every manufacturer just kind of made their own thing, and there really wasn't a standard for that equipment's operating. In 1981, they passed the Consumer Patient Radiation Health and Safety Act. It's a mouthful. And what that did is it required the states to develop minimum standards for operators of dental X-ray equipment. In the state of Tennessee, for example, you have to, whether you're a dental assistant or a dental hygienist, you have to have a certificate that you completed a radiation safety course. That's part of their State Practice Act. In the state of Alabama, I think the only thing that's required is that you're, over 18 years old. So every state is required to set their minimum standards, and that's just, up to each state to do. Some of our measurement terminology, the ICRU, which is the International Commission on Regulatory Units, again, not going to ask you that, just give you the information. They establish standards that clearly define radiation units and the radiation quantities. And I have a handout in just a moment that I'll show you, and that's actually probably going to be on a separate recording, but it is in your Blackboard shell in the same folder. But there's 2 sets of terms used for defining the units of radiation. Okay, and then you probably will want to pause this, go watch that video, and then come back. Some radiation measurement considerations. You can measure an entrance dose, an exit dose, and a depth dose. Traditionally, a depth dose is just kind of an estimation. They look at the amount of radiation that went in. They look at the amount of radiation that came out the opposite side, and then they would do kind of an estimation of the depth. We can actually do a depth dose by putting a sensor in the patient's mouth and a sensor on one cheek and the other. So it really just depends on the type of x-ray that you're looking at. Okay, some other measurement variables. The area exposed. Some cells are more sensitive than others, so depending on the area that's exposed, you may have more concerns. If the radiation source is internal versus external, you would have to take that into consideration. The strength of the beam. We talked earlier in a different recording about how wavelength affects how much of the radiation is absorbed. The more that's absorbed, the more damage you have. So the stronger the beam, up to a point, makes this radiation safer. And we just talked about absorption of the tissues. That's how the radiation does the damage, is by being absorbed in the tissue. The density of the structure, the more dense a structure is, the more of the radiation is going to be absorbed. That's why you end up with radiopaque things on your image. And the output of the x-ray machine, you want to be able to see those settings and understand how those settings work together so that you understand what kind of x-rays that machine is producing. Okay, some other radiation protection features. You've got safety measures. Some of those safety measures are going to include the lead apron, standing 6 feet away, using protective shielding, your filtration, your collimation. All of those are safety measures that add to that protection. Some other things that are not listed, but would be still in this same list, would be safety training. Anytime you take a radiation course that teaches you better technique and safer ways to handle the images, all of those things are going to add to the radiation protection. The ALARA concept is an acronym. ALARA stands for as low as reasonably achievable. And what that means is that you want to set your radiation dose for the lowest exposure to the patient that you can and still get a diagnostic image. If you turn the setting down too low and you're not getting a diagnostic image, then you're not really being safe about your use of radiation. Okay, another safety measure or safety feature is that when you're taking radiographs, you need either a protective shield or wall that would be between you and the source of radiation, or you need the ability to stand 6 feet away from that source of radiation. Being 6 feet away isn't necessarily the only thing that you have to consider, because you need to be 90 to 135 degrees out of the primary beam. So if the primary beam is shooting straight ahead, you need to be 90 degrees, so either to the right or left of that, and then 135, meaning that from either straight to the side, either right or left, partially to the back, but not standing directly behind the machine. Because if you're standing directly behind the machine, as it shoots forward, x-rays can bounce off something and come straight back at you. So that's why 6 feet away, 90 to 135 degrees out of the primary beam, unless there's a protective shielding or wall. And all persons not involved should leave the room. The exception to this is that the patient is going to be the only person in the room while the x-rays are being exposed, unless the patient needs assistance. Say it's a child or a special needs patient that the parent has to sit in there and hold them to help keep them still, to help keep the sensor or the film in their mouth. Then in that instance, the parent is now involved, and so they're helping manage the patient, and they would need a lead apron also. but the operator always needs to leave the room because you would be exposed more frequently. Okay, and this is just a little information about the lead apron. It's another safety feature. It's not legally required in all states, but it is an important method of protecting the reproductive tissues and protecting children. With the thyroid collar, you won't always use the thyroid collar. When you take panoramics, you're definitely not going to use the thyroid collar. But it does protect the neck region from exposure to the x-rays because the thyroid gland is very sensitive and a lot of your lymph nodes are very sensitive. But just remember, when you're taking a panoramic, you want to remove the thyroid collar or use a lead apron that does not have a thyroid collar because it will interfere with and show up on your image. And that concludes part 1.